Hello YouTube! In this video I'm going to outline some of Hume's political philosophy. Obviously Hume is a major figure in philosophy and he did write quite a bit of political philosophy, but this aspect of his work doesn't get quite so much attention, so we're going to talk about some of it today. We're going to focus mainly on the foundational issues, the conceptual issues, rather than the more specific political proposals that Hume favoured. Obviously those foundational questions continue to be relevant to political philosophy today, whereas Hume, writing 250 years ago, some of the more specific problems that he was concerned about don't really concern us anymore. Okay then, so first, one of the debates on which Hume has had the most influence, and one of the central questions of political philosophy in Hume's day and in ours, is the debate around political allegiance. What is the reason for allegiance to the government? Another way of putting the question is, what is the source of the government's political authority? That is, the right of the government to rule over its citizens. So as I said, this remains one of the foundational problems in political philosophy. As Hume puts the issue, he aims to explain, and I quote, "the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers." In Hume's time in particular, this debate was exacerbated particularly by the rejection of the divine right of kings. Right? If the reason for allegiance to the state is not that the state derives its authority from God, well, what is the reason? Where does the state get its authority from? Now, it's worth noting that we can distinguish two ways of approaching this question. We might be interested in the descriptive question of why it is that people submit themselves to the state. And on this point, there's a kind of minor paradox. Hume points out that the force lies with the people, with the many. If the people decided to resist the government, they would surely be successful just through numbers alone. A government can exist only as long as enough of the people continue to obey it. So we might want to explain, just as a descriptive matter, how exactly is it that governments achieve the submission of the people? Alternatively, we might ask the normative question. What is it, if anything, that makes government rule morally legitimate? Why are we under a moral obligation to obey the government? Why do we morally owe our allegiance to the government? Why do we have a moral duty to obey? So we have this descriptive question and this normative question. Now, unfortunately, Hume himself doesn't always clearly distinguish between these two issues. Generally, he seems more interested in answering the descriptive question of how the state actually derives its power, rather than providing a normative justification for the state. Nevertheless, as we will see, he makes important points about various normative claims. So just because these two problems are not always clearly distinguished in Hume's discussion, they're not always going to be clearly distinguished as we go through this video. But it's important to bear in mind that there is a significant distinction here. Just keep this in mind as we look at some of Hume's arguments. So our question is, what is the reason for people's allegiance to the government? What makes allegiance to the government a moral obligation? Now, among philosophers looking for a secular answer to this question, the standard answer in Hume's time was provided by the social contract theory associated with Hobbes and Locke. As Hume understood social contract theory, it worked essentially as follows. We first assume that all men are born equal. Nobody has the right to command another due to their inherent characteristics or due to them being given that right by God or whatever. Rather, we owe our allegiance to a government only when we consent to it, only when we have bound ourselves to it through the obligation of a promise. So we consent to give up some of our liberties and to recognise the authority of the state in exchange for certain benefits provided by the state. The state protects our rights, the state maintains social order, and so on. Right, so the basic idea, there is a contract between the people and the state, and that is why the people owe their allegiance to the state. In a stateless society, there are no constraints on how individuals may act with respect to each other. One man may plunder the possessions of another, or even kill another in order to achieve his goals. So in such a situation, we have a war of all against all. Now we can see that pretty much everybody would be better off if they were to agree to recognise an authority that would prevent such conflict and protect the rights to life and property. Right. So in this situation, it is to our mutual benefit to give up some liberty and in return gain the peace, stability and security provided by the state. So yeah, the authority of the state derives from consent. And Hume's major contribution to political philosophy is his rejection of this social contract theory. So Hume points to a number of difficulties here. First of all, as a matter of empirical fact, there is no record of any contract ever taking place, and very often the historical record quite clearly refutes the contract theory. If you survey history, you will find many governments that assert authority through conquest, not through consent of the population. You know, in cases like these, there's not even the pretense of establishing political authority through a voluntary contract, through consent. And we also find many subjects of government, many citizens, who take themselves to have obligations to their government, even though no agreement was ever made, in the same kind of way that children have obligations to obey their parents, even though no agreement was ever made. In any case, Hume says, even if a contract event had occurred, every existing government has changed so significantly in terms of those who rule and in terms of the policies that it enforces, that any earlier contract could not make the current system legitimate, right? So the original government that was contracted to exist has now changed. And furthermore, people can't be bound by contracts entered into by their ancestors. Like that's like just clearly, right? I mean, just because somebody in the past entered into some contract, that doesn't place me under the contract. So even if social contract theory were correct as an account of how some governments arose or were legitimated in the past, it cannot account for the political authority of present governments. Ultimately, then, we can maintain the social contract theory only if we accept that no actually existing government is morally entitled to rule. But Hume considered this absurd, right? Like, of course, there are plenty of governments that are morally entitled to rule, at least in Hume's view, and in the view of most other philosophers in his time. Now, these kinds of problems were anticipated by contract theorists, in particular Locke. The basic issue underlying all of these points is that, well, people don't actually consent. They don't explicitly consent to the governments that rule over them. And Locke responds to this by appealing to tacit consent. The idea is, well, okay, I've never actually entered into a formal contract with the state. I've never explicitly promised the state my obedience in return for the benefits it provides. But I do give tacit consent to the state. The idea of tacit consent is that I can consent to something without explicitly saying this. My consent is revealed in my behaviour. And in particular, I choose to continue living under a particular state and therefore reap the benefits provided by it, the benefits of protection, social harmony, certain services. This demonstrates my consent to the authority of that state, and that establishes my obligation to obey it. So I guess this is the if you don't like it, then leave response, right? By choosing to remain in a territory, I consent to be ruled by its government. So Hume gives a number of responses to this move. First of all, he points out that most people quite explicitly take it that political allegiance is not a matter of consent. Hume says, I quote, "Where he thinks, as all mankind do who are born under established governments, that by his birth he owes allegiance to a certain prince or form of government, it would be absurd to infer a consent or choice, which he expressly, in this case, renounces and disclaims." In other words, most people take themselves to be subject to political obligation simply due to the circumstances of their birth. So they were born under a particular state, and just because of that, they have the obligation to obey it. So most people see themselves as born with an allegiance to their rulers, and there is explicitly no consent involved here. And so, like, well, what sense does it make to postulate some sort of hidden tacit consent which contradicts the stated reasons that people actually give? So I mean, the argument seems to be something like this. People conceive of political obligation as arising from birth. It's not possible to enter into contracts at birth, so people do not conceive of themselves as entering into contracts with the state. But a person can enter into a contract only if they actually conceive of themselves as doing so. So people don't enter into contracts with the state. Or at the very least, to postulate tacit consent to a contract is to postulate that there's some hidden mental process, even though this mental process would contradict the thoughts and feelings that people actually articulate. And Hume finds this absurd. Now, it's not clear to me that this is quite fair to the defender of tacit consent. Hume seems to be assuming that tacit consent must be a mental process of some sort, that the postulation of tacit consent involves inferring a particular mental state in the citizens. It seems to me that a more plausible account is that tacit consent is just given by one's actual behaviour. I mean, that seems to be Locke's idea, right? You tacitly consent to the government of a territory when you remain in that territory rather than leave. I mean, indeed, what's really appealing about the idea of tacit consent is that it allows us to put aside questions of what people are intending themselves to do. Like, it doesn't matter what your intentions are. Your tacit consent to a state is revealed in your actual behaviour. So maybe this kind of misses the point of tacit consent. However, Hume has a number of other arguments that do not suffer from this defect. So Hume's second point is that failure to leave a territory is rarely of any significance because very few citizens are actually capable of leaving a given country, even if they strongly object to the leaders. Leaving is beyond the means of many people because they're too poor or because they do not know the languages or customs of other cultures. Leaving isn't really a live option for them. So we can't infer their consent from their failure to leave. As Hume puts it, we could just as well say that a man on a ship freely consents to the commands of the captain, even though he was carried aboard while sleeping and the only way off would be to jump into the ocean. Right? It's quite clear in this case that, you know, if that man has a duty to obey the captain, and maybe he does, right? But if he has that duty, it's clearly not through consent. It's not because he consented to the authority of the captain. He never agreed to his circumstances in the first place, and he has no genuine ability to change them because there are no reasonable alternatives. And this is the case, Hume thinks, for many citizens of many states. Not all, of course. Some people are capable of leaving, but there will be many citizens where leaving just isn't a live option. There's no reasonable alternative to them other than to remain. Third, Hume attempts to provide cases in which the criteria for tacit consent are not satisfied, and yet we would still judge the state to have political authority. So, the idea of tacit consent is that you consent when you choose to remain in the country. So the possibility of leaving is a necessary condition for tacit consent. But now consider a government that prohibits its people from emigrating. For example, if a country is seeing high numbers of its citizens emigrating elsewhere, Hume says that the government may justly restrict them in order to prevent depopulation. He thinks that this will improve the well-being of the country as a whole, promote peace and security, prevent the country from declining economically. Right? There are problems associated with depopulation. And I notice that on the slides I wrote overpopulation rather than depopulation. Obviously that was a bit of a slip in response to what are the actual problems of our time, I guess. But no, so that should say, if a country is losing high numbers of its citizens, its government may justly restrict emigration to prevent depopulation. Hume says that the common opinion would be that in preventing emigration, in this case, the government has acted justly. And yet, clearly, the government has removed the possibility of tacit consent because it's preventing people from leaving, so people can't just choose to leave. Or consider a case in which people are in fact capable of leaving and they take this option, right? They're dissatisfied with their present government, so they form a group, they decide to move to an uninhabited region and they found their own new society. Now in this case, Hume says their government can still, quite rightly, claim them as its subjects, and so claim their new society as part of its own. Right? In other words, all these people have done is expanded the territory, expanded the scope of the original government. So again, this is a case where people have actually tried to leave, right? But the government has stopped them from doing so. And Hume takes it, again in this case, right, common opinion would find this perfectly justifiable, right? So this is a case where the conditions for tacit consent are removed, yet we would still judge, Hume thinks, the government to have legitimate authority over these subjects. The fourth argument is that Hume argues we can find cases where the criteria for tacit consent are satisfied, and yet we would not recognise the government as having legitimate authority. So Hume considers the example of a powerful usurper who overthrows a well-functioning government. Let's suppose that this previous government was successful, stable, promoted much good in the society, was well supported by the population, and so on. The usurper is abhorred by most of the population, but he sustains such discipline in his own troops that no hint of rebellion has ever been raised among the rest of the population. Everybody simply assumes that the rebellion would fail. We might add to Hume's scenario that the usurper is running the country very poorly otherwise, and yet people are permitted to leave if they so choose. Indeed, we could even imagine a situation in which the usurper encourages the native population to leave, right? He provides them with the means to leave and encourages them to do so because he would prefer the native population to be replaced with his own people. Does this usurper have legitimate authority? Well, by the criteria of tacit consent, where we consent when we choose to stay, yes, he does. Again, Hume thinks that common opinion would consider this absurd, right? Clearly this is a case of an illegitimate government. Now, notice that in these previous two arguments, Hume is testing the contract theory against common opinion. He produces cases where leaving is prohibited, but common opinion judges the government legitimate, and cases where leaving is possible and maybe even encouraged, but common opinion judges the government illegitimate. So this involves an appeal to intuition or common sense. Hume is quite explicit that, at least in his view, in moral matters, common opinion is authoritative. Indeed, he sees it as basically the only standard by which moral and political theories can be tested. He says, I quote, "Though an appeal to general opinion may justly, in the speculative sciences of metaphysics, natural philosophy, or astronomy, be deemed unfair and inconclusive, yet in all questions with regard to morals as well as criticism, there is really no other standard by which any controversy can ever be decided." Now, of course, this is a controversial position. People inclined to see moral and political philosophy as a tool of reform, or people inclined towards realism in metaethics, might well question whether such weight should be placed on, common sense, common opinion. But that's the kind of background to Hume's argument here, right? He's trying to produce cases where the contract theory can be shown to be in violation of common opinion, and he takes this to be a serious problem with the theory. Okay, let's turn to Hume's final argument. Hume notices that on the contract theory, the moral obligation to obey the government arises from a moral obligation, a prior moral obligation to keep our promises, because a contract is a kind of promise, right? We're obligated to comply with the promises we make, so with the contracts we make. When we make a promise, we place ourselves under an obligation. This is something we can freely choose to do. We may freely choose to impose these kinds of restraints on ourselves, and one way we might restrain ourselves is by submitting ourselves to the authority of a government. That's the point of the contract theory. But now Hume asks, okay, why do we have an obligation to keep promises? Well, according to Hume, this obligation exists simply because keeping promises, the institution of promising, furthers the common good. Right? The institution of promising makes us all better off in the long run because it allows us to rely on each other to do the things that we say we will do. That's really useful. Like, if I can kind of place myself under certain constraints in return for something from you or whatever, like, it just makes everything more efficient, more reliable. Promising is a very useful institution. It furthers the common good. That's why we have the obligation to keep promises. So, the social contract theory ultimately derives the moral obligation to obey the government from a moral obligation to further the common good, without the assumption that we should further the common good, that we should do what is to the benefit of society as a whole. There is no reason why we should care about keeping promises, and so no reason why we should bother fulfilling our contracts. Now, this is, of course, again, a controversial claim. Somebody like Kant would have a different account of why we're obligated to keep promises. But according to Hume, the obligation to keep promises is because promising furthers the common good. Now, Hume says, look, we can just cut out the middleman here. The source of political allegiance is simply utility. It is simply that obedience to the government furthers the common good. We have a duty to obey the government because this improves the peace, stability, well-being of society. So, as Hume says, the sole foundation of the duty of allegiance is the advantage which it procures to society, and by preserving peace and order among mankind. And he also says, government binds us to obedience only on account of its tendency to public utility. Note that utility here is meant in a general sense. It's not strictly the traditional utilitarian sense of pleasure, but still, I mean, we can see Hume is adopting a kind of proto-utilitarian position. Ultimately, government authority is justified because government increases utility. And crucially, the social contract theory doesn't really offer an alternative to this, because on contract theory, the duty to obey the government rests on the duty to keep promises, but the duty to keep promises only exists because it increases utility. So we see here not just an argument against social contract theory, but a robust alternative position on what makes government authority legitimate. Right? Government is something that promotes the common good, and people have a duty to further the common good, so people have a duty to sustain the government. People have a duty to give their allegiance to the government. Okay then, so for Hume, political allegiance is a matter of utility, but he doesn't leave the matter there. Why is it that government promotes utility, and how exactly does government secure its power over the population? After all, while it may be morally appropriate to obey the government, that doesn't explain why people actually do so, because people often do things that are morally wrong. So, in answer to these questions, Hume appeals to convention. Government derives its utility and its power from conventions that solve coordination problems. Now, in Hume's analysis, a convention obtains when large numbers of people follow a particular pattern of behaviour, where each person considers it in their self-interest to follow that behaviour, given that others consider it in their self-interest to follow that behaviour as well. So, in other words, given that I believe that other people will obey the convention because it's in their self-interest to do so, it becomes in my self-interest to obey the convention myself. Or as Hume puts it, the actions of each of us have a reference to those of the other and are performed upon the supposition that something is to be performed on the other part. What it makes sense for me to do is dependent on what others are doing. And, as long as other people are following a particular pattern of behaviour, it becomes in my self-interest to follow that pattern as well. Now, crucial thing to note here is that for a convention to obtain, it's not necessary that anybody make any promises or enter into any contracts. There need not even be any discussion of the matter. Conventions can arise spontaneously in a population of interacting individuals, all pursuing their own self-interest, or not necessarily even their own self-interest. They may well have plenty of concern for others as well, which Hume acknowledged. Hume did not see us as being fundamentally egoistic. But the point is, if you have a population of interacting individuals just pursuing their interests, conventions may arise spontaneously without any need for contract or promise. So in our social lives, we face a variety of coordination problems. We can define these as problems that meet three conditions. First, we have a situation where we can make everybody better off, provided we all adopt a particular pattern of behaviour. Second, there are a multitude of possible solutions. So there are many different patterns of behaviour that would improve our condition. But third, it's impractical for us all to come together to explicitly decide which solution to favour. So what we ultimately settle on arises by convention. The classic example of this kind of problem is the rules of the road. Which side of the road should we drive on? Clearly, everybody would be better off if all of those who are heading in the same direction drove on the same side of the road. This would massively increase efficiency and decrease the probability of collisions. But there are alternative solutions available. It doesn't really matter whether we choose the left or the right, and we can't bring the whole population together to explicitly decide, right? Like, at no point do we all sit down and take a vote or anything like that. The convention for driving on the left or right will arise spontaneously. Now, once everybody has settled on a particular pattern, we will all have a very strong incentive to follow it, because doing so makes everybody better off. If I were to insist on driving on the right, even though everybody else drives on the left, I would do great harm to myself. I'd make my own life worse. It's in my self-interest to follow the convention. So we don't really need laws to tell us to follow conventions like this, and we don't really need to make any kind of agreement or promise to follow conventions like this. Now, of course, in a country where driving left is the convention, then driving on the right probably would break the law, because there are actually laws against dangerous driving. Nevertheless, even if there were no such law, we would expect that almost everybody would continue to abide by the convention. So with social conventions, what we find is that once people have coordinated on a particular outcome, it's self-reinforcing, right? The behaviour is successful. This fact indicates that we can expect to succeed by adopting the same behaviour again in the future. We come to expect others to continue behaving that way. And even if I think that a particular coordination outcome is suboptimal for some people, or just for myself, I will have very little incentive to even attempt to change it. Like this, regardless of whether I personally prefer driving on the left or the right, right? I have very little incentive to even attempt to go against the grain. So we see here a case where, through individuals pursuing their own interests, social order evolves spontaneously without the need for like supervision, regulation, agreement. So this is, this is convention in general. Now, at this point, it's worth turning to another key aspect of Hume's political theory, his account of property. Hume appeals to convention to explain the development of property ownership. What exactly is property? What makes it the case that X belongs to P? And how do we establish this in any given case? How do we establish which objects belong to which persons? Well, there are a variety of approaches to this question. In Hume's time, and still to this day, a classic account is given by Locke. Locke proposes that there is a natural law of property, which is discovered by reason, which specifies the conditions for the just acquisition and distribution of property. In particular, for example, you gain a property right in previously unowned land by mixing your labour with it, subject to the proviso that you leave enough and as good for others. The initially unowned land becomes your property via labour mixing. That's one aspect, right? Just for example. So for Locke, rights to property are, in a sense, conceptually prior to social order and to government. We use reason to work out the correct property relations, and then society is obligated to comply with those relations, and it is the job of government to enforce them. If a government fails to protect the true property rights, it has violated its part of the social contract, and people may justly rebel. So, on this kind of view, I may have a right, a property right, to some object X. X may be my property, even if the society in which I live does not recognise this. Or even if I don't live in any society whatsoever. Maybe I'm like the only person in the world, right? But by mixing my labour with things, they become my property. So if I discover an untapped resource and then I create something valuable out of it with my labour, I have a property right to that thing, no matter what my society says. According to Hume, by contrast, there is no natural right to property. Indeed, there is no moral justification for the initial acquisition or distribution of property, and we don't need to provide such a justification in order to show that current property ownership, along with exchange on the market, is morally legitimate. On Hume's view, ownership relations are simply a matter of convention. My property is just that which is granted to me by the laws of society, assuming that some social order has developed in this respect. So as Hume says, our property is nothing but those goods whose constant possession is established by the laws of society. Property is a social construct through and through. Now, Hume's conventionalist position here is informed by his empiricism. I assume you're familiar with this. So recall that on Hume's view, all ideas are derived from experience, either from sensations, or, impressions of sensation, or from the experience of the operations of our own minds, our passions and emotion, what Hume calls impressions of reflection. Now, given this, does it make sense to suppose that there are objective facts about property relations which we might discover? Indeed, maybe the prior question is, well, like how do we come to have the idea of property at all, right? Well, consider transferring some item from one person to another. Say, I give you a book. Well, clearly, this doesn't involve any change in the book itself. The book merely moves from one place to another. Or maybe not, right? The book doesn't have to even change location. Something can become your property, even if you don't currently have it in your possession. So I might give you a book, but then you forget to take the book with you, so it remains in my house. Even so, the ownership relation has changed, right? It used to be that I owned the book, now you own the book. But nothing in the world, right, nothing in the book, none of its properties have changed. So from the world itself, we can't even form any idea of property. It's inconceivable if you just take the stuff that's happening in the external world. Instead, the idea of property must come from the operations of our own minds. What happens when the book is transferred from me to you is that our sentiments towards the book change. In general, people feel differently about objects that come into their possession. This then leads them to behave differently towards those objects and to form the expectation that others will also behave differently, in particular that others will not interfere with those objects. These feelings serve an important function given our desires and our contingent circumstances. Hume notes that in circumstances of great abundance, there would be no point developing any particular feelings towards objects. If somebody could take whatever they want from me, it would be no matter because I could, without any effort, gain something else of equal value. Similarly, in conditions of extreme scarcity, where nobody has any of their basic material needs met, where there's just not enough food and all of the population is starving, none of these kinds of conventions would endure. If I need food to survive, I'm going to take it no matter what the cost. So our actual circumstances are indeterminate between these. We desire various resources, but we exist in conditions of relative scarcity, and as a result we develop these sentiments of attachments towards particular objects, right? There are certain objects that we just feel more strongly inclined to because that are valuable to us, that we will try to protect, etc. Now, it's on the basis of such sentiments that property conventions can develop. Of course, we don't know the exact processes by which such conventions came to arise, but Hume does give a kind of how possibly explanation, an account of how this could have happened. So consider a society without property conventions. People just take the items they want and use them. Sometimes they fight over resources, sometimes they cooperate, but nobody respects any kind of right to property. Over time, different people will come to have power over different things. The distribution of resources will be largely arbitrary. Now, in this situation, the people can reduce conflict by adopting a simple rule. The rule, I will not take the valuable items currently in your control, provided that you comply with the same restraint with respect to me. Why would you adopt this rule? Well, as noted, we are led by habit to adopt certain attitudes towards external items. If we have long enjoyed a particular item, if that item has long been part of our life, if we've manipulated it or brought it into being, we naturally feel close to it and prefer it to other things that may be more distant from us. So as Hume says, what has long lain under our eye and has often been employed to our advantage, that we are always the most unwilling to part with. So those objects that are close to us, that we frequently manipulate, we will feel a sense of pride about them. We'll come to regard those objects perhaps even as sort of extensions of ourselves. I mean, recall how for Locke, property ownership is kind of an extension of self-ownership. You own yourself, so you own your labour, then you mix your labour with unowned things, and by this means you, in a sense, like add something of yourself to those things, and by this means those things become yours. That the world is like an extension of yourself, or part of the world is. So yeah, anyway, right, those things that we have long had under our control, we are attached to. On the other hand, we can easily live without those items that we are not accustomed to. After all, we have been living without them, right? So it's on this basis that people might initially separate possessions out. They might initially like carve up the world into ownership. We just say everybody is taken to legitimately own what they at present have under their control. So, it's really quite straightforward how an initial convention for property ownership could arise. And with this rule in place, with this convention in place, conflict reduces, cooperation and trade increases, division of labour becomes possible. This allows people to develop expertise in specific trades rather than focus only on acquiring the necessities for life. The people will create conditions where people have the incentive to produce new goods for the market. So, with this rule, the peace and prosperity of society is substantially increased. And the rules might then become more sophisticated in response to various problems. So we can take the rule, I will not take the valuable items that you have produced through your labour or found by good fortune, provided you comply with the same restraint with respect to me. There's also a very natural principle of transferring property. An item changes possession from person A to person B just when A consents to give it to B. This principle supports exchange. It allows people to better fit the property distribution to people's desires. These rules become established by convention. So we see how the initial property rules follow from the natural inclinations of the mind, right? You start with this natural attachment to those items that are currently in one's possession, and we have that natural attachment because of our contingent circumstances, because we exist in conditions of relative scarcity. From these natural sentiments, certain conventions really straightforwardly follow. These conventions are self-reinforcing because they make everybody better off. No explicit agreement or contract is required because the usefulness of this pattern of behaviour is obvious. Other people will see the usefulness and will fall in line. The few who fail to fall in line will just be excluded from cooperative activity. This is easily achieved in a small-scale society where everybody can monitor everybody else and track the interactions with all others. And once a property convention is in place, it's in my self-interest to comply. So a property convention arises spontaneously through the ordinary self-interested interactions of many individuals. Once it's in place, even if I was like very strong, so maybe I was better off in the previous system, actually no, it's now going to be in my self-interest to comply with this convention. Furthermore, the convention will become moralised. If a person violates a property convention through theft, this will cause uneasiness to the victim. It will also cause uneasiness to society as a whole by threatening the stability of society. People will start to contemplate the chaos that would ensue if too many others were to violate the convention. And so in all of these ways, the theft will evoke feelings of anger and sympathy in others, and that will lead to a kind of moralisation of these rules, right? When you see a theft happening, you feel sympathy for the victim, you feel anger to the perpetrator. Now, in Hume's view, that's all there is to property. Once you have a property convention in place, you have a definition of ownership, of property rights, of theft, of justice, and so on. It makes no sense to speak of ownership or property in the absence of social conventions like this. So it makes no sense to ask whether a particular social convention respects people's rightful property entitlements. Indeed, the resulting property conventions of a society, and certainly the distribution of property, will be to a large degree arbitrary. Well, that's just the nature of conventions. Whether we drive on the left or the right is arbitrary, but we have to choose one, and either choice will improve utility. In the case of property, we may well consider a particular convention suboptimal in various ways, but still almost any convention is better than nothing. There are a range of property conventions we may adopt where we will all be, or at least the vast majority of us will be, better off by shifting from a situation in which there just are no property conventions to a situation in which we've coordinated on a specific convention. Now, from Hume's point of view, it really doesn't matter how property distribution was initially established. Right? We may well judge that it's suboptimal or morally defective. This might be a Lockean's view of current property distribution, because so much of how property is currently distributed has arisen by theft and fraud. Right? Indeed, the prevalence of theft and fraud throughout history is a serious problem for Lockean accounts. Many apparent property entitlements must be illegitimate on the Lockean approach, because we know that current holdings are partly due to, or have arisen partly due to, theft, slavery, conquest, whatever. We can't trace the precise history of most of these acts, so we can't say which holdings are legitimate. That's a general problem for Lockean accounts. You might want to check out my video on libertarianism and distributive justice for more on this. On Hume's account, by contrast, there's no need to work out how property would be distributed had theft and conquest and so on not occurred. We simply note that we have a convention in place, that this convention tends to promote social utility, and that's that. The distribution of holdings under that convention is legitimate, even if that distribution arose through processes that would have violated the convention had the convention been in place earlier. Indeed, on Hume's view, it really makes no sense to talk of theft prior to the establishing of a property convention, because theft is defined by the convention. Okay, so that's Hume's account of property. But of course, we began with the question of political allegiance, and it is time to return to that. So essentially, Hume's view is that government is justified for its utility with respect to property convention. Hume thinks that in a small-scale society, social order and the maintenance of property conventions is not problematic. But what about when societies become larger? Most people don't all know each other. Communal conventions may therefore not cover the entirety of society. Different groups will develop different conventions. What happens when they intermingle? More importantly, as society grows larger and productivity increases, there will be a greater degree and variety of luxury goods, which will encourage violation of property rules. This is exacerbated by the fact that since most people don't know each other, transactions will be more anonymous. So it's more likely that people will be able to get away with theft. Unlike in a small-scale society, everybody can monitor everybody else. Everybody knows everybody else well. That's not the case in a society with large numbers of people. Also, in a larger society, my defection will have less effect proportionally. So even if I recognise that I would be better off were everybody to follow the rules, I will be drawn to the immediate benefit of easy theft, given that I'm less likely to be punished and the impact of my defection will be infinitesimal. In general, people are drawn to near-term benefits even if they recognise that this may impose a longer-term cost. So government is useful because it can solve this problem by providing greater enforcement of property conventions. Now, this is not an account of how government actually arises. Indeed, Hume himself doubts that government can arise in this kind of way. He speculates that governments begin as a way of securing defence from foreign attackers. So that is, a small-scale society with a proto-government form of organisation will be better able to repel attacks. When a society is threatened, the people appoint a certain person as chieftain, give him command of an army, and so on. The society coheres behind a single leader. This structure that arises as a way of defending from outside attacks, this structure can then be applied to enforce property conventions within the society. Anyway, this is the primary way in which government promotes social utility, by supporting property conventions, and so allowing societies to grow larger and larger and allowing productivity to increase beyond what would be possible in a small-scale society. So in the long run, what accounts for how government maintains its power is convention. Take, first of all, the point of view of the government itself. The rulers, like all people, have an interest in obeying property conventions for reasons already stated, but they also have an interest in enforcing those conventions. And this should be fairly obvious. Those conventions led to their wealth and status, so they preserve their wealth and status by protecting the conventions. So they don't need to make any kind of contract or agreement with the people in order to govern the people. They'll just do it naturally by pursuing their own self-interest. It is in their interest to enforce the property conventions. So that's what they'll do. So government itself, right, maintains itself partly by convention, right? The rulers are themselves following a convention in enforcing the property conventions. Now consider the point of view of the governed. Initially, we might set up a state due to direct self-interest. It might be explicitly designed to enforce particular conventions. We might even agree to it by contract. But pretty soon, allegiance is guaranteed by convention. Once citizens have coordinated on the state, most people will acquiesce to state power most of the time. This very fact makes it in my interest to acquiesce also, partly because the coordination of most people most of the time gives the government the power to crush and punish rebels, and partly because failure to acquiesce may directly harm me, even if there is no punishment from the state. All laws and regulations are enormously complex. Everybody else will be following them. It's sensible to adopt a general policy of conforming to the status quo. Furthermore, since government secures property relations, and stable property relations are beneficial to me, even if they're arbitrary, even if they're not what I would consider ideal, our coordination on the property conventions tends to support the power of the government. So property conventions promote utility, government enforces property laws, the benefits of property laws help maintain the government. They make it in my interest to maintain the government. Again, there's no agreement necessary, not even tacit agreement. Allegiance to the government is secured by convention. So we see here these two key aspects of Hume's view. The only foundation of our duty of allegiance to the government is the utility it produces to society. That utility is primarily found in its enforcement of property conventions, though of course it may do other things as it develops. Furthermore, allegiance is itself secured through further conventions. Now, importantly, on Hume's view, we can't argue that particular systems of property law or government are necessary or natural or right. There are many alternative systems that work just as well and that may, in many respects, be superior. The empirical evidence of other societies that function well despite radical differences in political and social organisation attests to this. So it really doesn't matter how a specific government arises. Government doesn't need to be based on consent, it doesn't need to be democratic, it may have arisen through conquest, whatever. The only relevant question is whether the government promotes utility. So this raises the question, when exactly are we justified in resisting the state? In principle, Hume's view allows for radical change. After all, he acknowledges that radically different alternative systems can work. He doesn't claim that the current system is in any way necessary or that it's supported by the natural law discovered by reason or anything like that. Hume's reasoning here is utilitarian. As we've seen, right, on Hume's view, the duty to obey the government is based on its utility in furthering the common good. So when judging the government, we simply weigh the present advantages against present disadvantages. We should obey the government when the advantages of recognising its authority outweigh the disadvantages. That's it. We might think that this allows quite a lot of scope for radical changes, for revolution. But Hume himself was fairly conservative on this point. He thinks that if a government is stable, matures, successfully enforces its laws and so on, then generally we should accept it, we should acquiesce to it. For many things, for many artificial things, and government is an artificial thing, it's socially constructed, for many artificial things we can perform lots of different trials, right? Like if I have an engine in my car, I can, without much risk, replace it with another one that I suspect may be more efficient. Well, I say I can do that, I don't actually know anything about cars, so that might be a bad example, but hopefully you get the point. For many things, we can change things out. We can try different arrangements to see what works. This is not the case with government. Changing government is very, very difficult. Radical change, most of the time, is simply too costly and will incur a variety of unintended consequences. So a first aspect of Hume's resistance to radical change is that he sees numerous disadvantages to revolution. First, revolution is almost always extremely violent and will land society in chaos. A revolution imposes a direct and immediate cost in the violence and disorder that it creates. And of course, by undermining the government, right, you don't just undermine the government, you also undermine things like the property conventions that are enforced by the government. So there's an enormous amount of just disorder and chaos and confusion that is produced by a revolution. Second, there's no guarantee that revolutions will succeed. They very often fail. Now, when government detects rebellion among its subjects, it will generally, and according to Hume, quite understandably and reasonably, respond with oppressive measures. So as Hume puts it, violent measures which they would never have embraced had everyone been inclined to submission and obedience. Right? Basically, an attempt at revolution is just as likely to make things worse as it is to improve them. Right? It's just as likely to make the government more oppressive. Third, a revolution in one country may erode the support for the government of others. So revolutionary thought can spread. Even if the government of your country is disadvantageous overall, well, that's not the only factor to consider. Most other governments are legitimate, and undermining their authority is a cost of rebellious activity. A second source of Hume's conservatism, his resistance to radical change, is the central role that he gives to convention. In general, Hume takes it that the very fact that a given institution exists suggests that the institution is useful. The basic idea here is, well, Hume has shown how in a variety of cases, general utility in the development of conventions to solve coordination problems is the cause of the development of various institutions, such as property, laws, government, and so on. And all of these institutions are, of course, interrelated. So we can infer, well, inductively, right, institutions tend to owe their existence to their utility. Generally, conventions will not develop if they did not serve some useful function. So we should be very cautious about overthrowing them. On top of this, of course, conventions and institutions are extremely complex. Current institutions function pretty well, right? Our society is fairly well ordered, fairly stable, fairly productive, and yet the conventions of our society are hopelessly complex. Hume says, and I quote, "Inheritance and contract stand for ideas infinitely complicated, and to define them exactly 100 volumes of laws and 1,000 volumes of commentators have not been found sufficient." Now, of course, this is unsurprising, given that these conventions arose by and large not as a product of rational design, but they evolved, right? These institutions evolved as conventions in response to specific problems in specific environmental and social circumstances. And they're all interrelated, right? So we've already seen how government and property are interrelated, and those conventions intermingle. So the conventions and institutions are so complex we can't possibly appreciate all of the ways they're integrated into our lives. Society is this complex machine. It's impossible for any one person to fully understand, and any change in one part of it will ramify through the rest of the system in many unforeseeable ways. When we argue for overthrowing an institution on the grounds that that institution is arbitrary or even suboptimal, this overlooks the fact that there are just a host of unforeseen consequences that can follow. So, in general, we should favour gradual reform over revolution, and we should generally, give our allegiance to the government. Hume, in general, was sceptical of attempts to plan society, right? Whereas radicals tend to propose major transformations of society in line with some abstract ideal that they've conceived through rational reflection, Hume, he favours gradual reform with an eye to preserving current conventions. The general message is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, in the end, Hume takes it that rebellion is justified. He takes it that government loses political authority only in cases of what he calls grievous tyranny and oppression, which is a bit vague, but the general message is that reform is almost always going to be preferred to revolution. So Hume was fairly conservative about this, at least. Okay, that's all. That's all I wanted to talk about today. Hope you found it interesting. Goodbye.